Hi guys, welcome to Functioning Ecosystems. This is part one, the very start of this new subject matter. So we're looking at topic 2, ecosystem dynamics, and the subject matter we're looking at is functioning ecosystems. So learning goals for this lesson, it's to sequence and explain the transfer and transformation of solar energy into biomass as it flows throughout biotic components of an ecosystem, including converting light to chemical energy and producing biomass and interacting with components of the carbon cycle. So this is our functioning ecosystem learning goal. Let's get into it. So the sun provides most of Earth's energy in the form of heat and light. And that is where this whole idea of energy begins with. When we look at these photosynthetic organisms, it starts with the sun. So plants and algae have evolved photosynthesis. Now you know that photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts from year 11, and it utilizes the sun's energy to convert to chemical energy. So plants will utilize the sun and be able to convert that to a form which they can later use for their own providing energy called cellular respiration. So a small proportion of solar energy is captured by plants and algae and transformed via photosynthesis, as I said, into chemical energy, i.e. organic compounds such as glucose. And if you recall, the formula for photosynthesis is 6 carbon dioxide plus 12 lots of water. In the presence of light energy, produces glucose, oxygen, and water as a byproduct. Now, a lot of formulas will just balance this out. So you'll have 6 water here, and they won't put water on this side. However, your syllabus has water on both sides, so I am presenting that to you there. But the basic idea, sunlight comes in, a small bit of that, only a tiny bit, not a huge amount of that sunlight, is converted into chemical energy, which we call, for example, glucose, all right, or sugars. Now, that chemical energy is actually released from the bonds of glucose molecules and used for metabolism when they are broken down during this process of cellular respiration. So plants will use the glucose that they produce. So here they produce that glucose, and then in the mitochondria, they'll use that glucose to be able to produce energy. We, however, will eat these plants which have produced that glucose, so photosynthesize, or the animals that have eaten the plant material. And once again, we produce energy in the same way through cellular respiration in the mitochondria. Now, the formula for cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen forms carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, so many people have come up with different ways to remember it. One was my favorite one that someone came up with was girls only want chocolate during Easter. To know the different ones, obviously not true at all, want chocolate all the time. But here, that's one way that you can remember that formula. Going on. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration, well, they are this key idea, the central processes in the cycling of carbon throughout living organisms here on Earth. So here plants, they take in carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide comes in. They then convert that carbon dioxide to glucose. Animals eat that glucose, and then they respire, releasing carbon dioxide back into the environment, and the cycle continues. So you can see how carbon is cycled throughout these two key processes, through plants taking in carbon dioxide via photosynthesis, converting it to glucose, which, as you would have seen on the other side, is C6H12O6. So here's our carbon. Animals take in or ingest that carbon, assimilate it, and eventually respire through cellular respiration, releasing CO2 back in. And this is the chief idea, or the central processes here of the carbon cycle within living organisms, which is what the syllabus is focusing on there. So solar energy is converted into what we call biomass through the action of those living organisms, plants and algae, those photosynthetic organisms. I will get you to write down this definition as a key one. So biomass is the total mass of living matter, so i.e. the organic matter in an ecosystem. So whenever you hear me say biomass, think of it as a total mass of living matter. All right, so that organic matter within that ecosystem there. So organisms that can capture sun's energy and produce their own organic compounds from water and carbon dioxide, obviously with the presence of sunlight, are termed autotrophs. Now, we'll most commonly use this term called producers, but this idea auto means that they can create their own food, okay? So they're capable of producing their own food through photosynthesis, and as a result, they are producers because they are producing the food for themselves, okay, or producing their own form of energy, their chemical energy there, which will be later used throughout subsequent levels and trophic levels throughout an ecosystem. So producers are the basis of all organic matter and form the base trophic level of biomass in every ecosystem. So we're going to look at this idea of trophic levels, these different levels throughout an ecosystem, but the base level, the beginning level of every ecosystem has producers. Now that might be plants if you're on land, or in algae if you're in water, or it could be phytoplankton if you're in the marine environment there. Okay, same with algae is marine, but you get the idea. They are the producers and they'll form the base level of any lot of trophic levels in an ecosystem there. So you do have to remember those photosynthetic organisms called autotrophs or producers will form that base level. Now a trophic level, I've used this word a few times, so let's get this definition down. So a trophic level is a level in the food chain of an ecosystem based on feeding relationships. So some of the feeding relationships you might have here is a producer, then you've got your primary consumers, which are herbivores, your secondary consumers, which are carnivores, your tertiary consumers, and it goes on, your quaternary consumers. However, as you'll learn, it doesn't often go up very high because of some of the restrictions that are actually there within an ecosystem due to the energy transfer and the energy that is lost. So a trophic level is just simply one of these levels here in a food chain. So that's what a trophic level is. Now producers differ in how well they convert light energy. Some producers can convert light energy to glucose really efficiently, okay, so into that chemical energy during photosynthesis. Others can't. How efficient these producers are, we call photosynthetic efficiency. Now if we look at a couple of examples, and these are the units of photosynthetic efficiency, so kilocalories per meter squared per year. Now a tropical rainforest has an average net productivity, which we'll talk about in a second, of 9,000, while a temperate grassland has an average net productivity of 2,200. So you can see that these ecosystems here differ in their photosynthetic efficiency. So the organisms, the plants in the tropical rainforest, have a higher photosynthetic efficiency than organisms there in that temperate grassland, those photosynthetic organisms, and therefore are able to convert that light energy into glucose more effectively than these plants by, as you can see, approximately 6,800 kilocalories per meter squared per year. The photosynthetic efficiency does depend on a variety of limiting factors. So things like sunlight, water, carbon dioxide availability, nutrient availability. Obviously, the greater there is of those things, the more photosynthetic efficient those organisms can be. Temperature, light intensity, and there's other factors like the nature of the organism themselves that do contribute to the efficiency. When you look at some of the ecosystems, you might notice something that's a bit surprising. Swamps and marshes have the highest level of photosynthetic efficiency, and that's because organisms like algae are really efficient. Even estuaries have a very high level of photosynthetic efficiency. Seagrasses, very efficient. When you look at other ecosystems, it's not surprising that desert scrub, extreme desert, they have a low efficiency due to the factors like this. Water are very low in those environments, so those organisms don't tend to have that high rate of photosynthesis. Or unlike a tropical rainforest, you've got plants that contain large amounts of chloroplasts ready to capture all the sunlight available to convert it into that chemical energy. Looking at around the world, tropical rainforests only cover about 4% of the Earth's surface, but they contribute to 25% of the world's gross primary productivity. And we call this GPPP. I think I went too many P's there. GPP. Let's just get that right. So GPP, gross primary productivity, is the amount of organic matter produced annually in an ecosystem by photosynthesis. So get this down. So when I talk about the gross primary, so this is referring to plants, so those producers, the very first stage of productivity. So the total primary productivity is the amount of organic matter produced annually in an ecosystem via photosynthesis. So when I look at all the rainforests in the world and the amount of organic matter that they produce on an annual basis, well, I'm saying that that's about 25% of the total primary productivity in the world. which obviously means they contribute a significant amount, and they're a very vital ecosystem for us to maintain and look after. But not all of that gross primary productivity is actually available to the next level in the trophic chain there. So consumers, for instance, they're not going to be able to get all of that photosynthesis or that chemical energy produced by photosynthesis by those plants, because producers actually use some of it for their own energy needs and respiration. Plants undergoing respiration all the time. They need energy to live, and therefore some of that glucose they produce, they actually use themselves. So therefore it's not available to the next level in that food chain as we move through the different trophic levels. And that's where this idea comes in. So this term here is the net. So the net primary productivity, again primary, we're referring to those producers, is the amount of organic matter made available to herbivores annually in an ecosystem. So the gross is the grand total, okay? So all of that photosynthesis, so here we've got our gross, so this is all. Now here we've got net, so the net is basically all minus the respiration, and that's going to equal your net. And you can see that here in this formula. So your net primary productivity equals your gross, so all of the total photosynthesis minus the energy used by that organism for cellular respiration. So when we look at a little bit of a summary here, we've talked about the fact that solar energy is where that energy enters in here to these ecosystems. So from sunlight that comes in, plants capture that sunlight, or algae or phytoplankton, but you get that idea. Those autotrophs, those producers, that base level in the trophic or food chain there, they capture that sunlight, they undergo photosynthesis. Now the total photosynthesis that they undergo to create chemical energy in the form of glucose, we call GPP, gross primary productivity. However, they will lose some of that energy, all right, that they produce as respiration. So we are losing energy out of this system. And therefore the energy that's passed on to our consumers, so our first order consumers, which are herbivores, which eat that plant material, we call that the net primary productivity. So the amount of energy here, all right, that's able to be passed on, we're looking at that as the net primary productivity, or NPP. Hopefully that makes sense. We've talked about the importance here of also the idea of the carbon cycle. So plants take in the CO2, all right, they convert that to glucose. That glucose is used in respiration. That respiration then releases that CO2 back in, and this chain continues. So hopefully you're getting those ideas as well out of this. Now autotrophs, i.e. those producers, well, they are consumed by what we call heterotrophs, i.e. consumers. So these are organisms that eat other organisms. So you can get this definition out. Heterotrophs, or consumers, are organisms that cannot photosynthesize. You and I cannot photosynthesize. I think that would be amazing. If you get your lunch, go outside, stick out your arms, capture all of that yummy sunlight goodness, and then you've got your food. We can't do that. We are reliant to consume other organisms. So when we talk about consumers, they are obviously organisms that consume others. Now, I'm most likely going to use this term consumers, and I'll mostly use producers, but understand that when I talk about producers, I'm talking about autotrophs there, and when I talk about consumers, I'm talking about heterotrophs. All right, so you've got those two ideas. Now, consumers can be ranked based on a particular order. So they can be classified as first order or primary consumers. They are herbivores that eat plant material. So write these down. So consumers can be first order or primary consumers, known as herbivores, that eat plant material. Comes next is second order consumers, and these are carnivores. These are organisms that are now eating these herbivores, i.e. like a bird eating a grasshopper. And your third order or higher consumers, well, they're carnivores that eat other carnivores. Like a snake that eats this bird is a third order consumer. And then you've got higher, quaternary, and that. But as we'll look at, these food chains, or the amount of trophic levels available within an ecosystem, tends to be limited to 3 or 4 consumers and no more. But we'll get into that in greater detail later. There are things, as you look at that, called omnivores, and they do tie in. So they're organisms that will eat both producers and consumers, and these may be both first and higher order consumers simultaneously, okay? So they may be eating that plant material and therefore a first order consumer, but they can be a second order consumer as well because they're eating those other consumers, so those herbivores themselves. So other organisms that are involved in the transfer and transformation of energy throughout ecosystems come under this idea of breaking down detritus. Now, detritus is the organic debris. I do know the movie Tenet used it to mean war debris, but it is the organic debris from decomposing plants and animals. This can be broken down by two organisms, and these guys are the unsung heroes of our ecosystems. And the first one are detritivores. So detritivores are organisms that ingest and digest the nutrients in detritus internally. And that's the key idea here. Detritivores is all about internal, okay? So internal and detritivores are the key idea there. So they break down that detritus internally, release the waste, and that is important to help get that turnover of essential nutrients in that ecosystem. There's also decomposers. So these are organisms that break down externally, all right, so they're doing it externally, dead organisms or waste matter, and then absorb the resulting nutrients. So these can be things like bacteria, fungi, and some protozoans. Now there's different ways to remember this. I always think internally I've got the I, and here I've got an I in detritivores. So I remember internal is detritivores. Well, once I remember that, decomposers is just simply the external there. So these bacteria, fungi, and protozoans, they release things like enzyme, which breaks down that organic debris, and then they absorb the nutrients from there. These organisms are very essential, and often they're the ones that we should be trying to protect and look after in an ecosystem. But who really wants to save a worm when you can save a cute, cuddly panda or something like that? So these guys, they break down that debris, and that enables, once again, this cycling of nutrients to continue within that ecosystem, because they provide nutrients which are taken up by the plants, which are our photosynthetic organisms, which of course capture sunlight, undergo photosynthesis, and produce chemical energy. That chemical energy is then passed through the food chain through the different trophic levels. So as a result, animals, which we call consumers, so consumers like your first order consumers are herbivores, which will eat that plant material. You then have your second order consumers, which are carnivores, which eat the herbivores, and third order and higher, which are carnivores, which eat other carnivores. So those are some of the key ideas. We also looked at this idea of gross primary productivity, which is basically all of the photosynthesis from those producing organisms, because we're looking at primary here. We're not just talking about gross productivity, which means I could be talking about the gross productivity of other organisms. We're talking about primary, so we're talking about plants. And we also considered the net primary productivity, which is basically all of the GPP here minus what they use in respiration, and that's what's available to your herbivores. So those next ones, that's what's able to be passed on. So some of that energy is lost from respiration, so not all of it is passed on to the next level, which is a reason why I've said that there's only so many different levels that we can have within this food chain, because as that energy is lost, there's less for the next one and less so on and so forth. That should get you through those first learning goals. It's really quite simple ideas, but hopefully it has made sense and set you up with a bit of terminology as we move forward.